Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. This is episode number 108. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined today by my friend and very special guest, Rick Hoeg of Hoeg Law of Virtual Legality. I have to say, I mean, I guess this is relevant, but you're like our first paid contributor now. I feel like I have like an MSNBC lawyer or a Fox News lawyer now that I can consult with. So to let people know, Mr. Hoeg is in constant demand for his expertise and all things legal. Of course, he's a gamer too, and we had him on the I was going to say Resogun, but the Returnal spoiler cast and review discussion, which was awesome, and people's feedback on that was excellent. They love you, but I feel like it's strange to continuously go to someone for their expertise and not pay them. So you are now a contributor of Last Stand Media, and so welcome in this first capacity when you're available to do so. And
yeah, very generous of you. Thank you. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, man, I'm pleased to have you, and I'm sorry that it's not under better circumstances. Although I imagine these sorts of talks will never be under better circumstances. So I wanted to ask you about what's going on with Activision. People are curious about this. The state of California sued Activision-Blizzard after a 2-year investigation that found a lot here, and I know a lot of people are not really up on it. I've only read cursorily about it myself. On the last episode of Sacred Symbols, I said that I was a little out of my depth and just want to kind of wait and see what's true and what's not in the court of law. Hopefully it just goes to court, but who knows if they'll settle or whatever. So anyway, I'm talking too much. I want to throw it over to you. You're going to do most of the talking here. What's happening with Activision Blizzard right now? What do people need to know?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think people that have at least heard that California has sued Activision in the last couple of days are aware of some of the most, I like to use the word lascivious, but certainly the most bright line items that have been alleged against Activision. And the lawsuit that was brought was by a department in California called the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. I don't know what pronunciation they prefer there, but DFEH. And they brought this lawsuit on behalf of the state of California because the state of California has a vested interest in companies not violating its laws, as well as on behalf of what they characterize as every aggrieved woman employee of Activision-Blizzard, Blizzard and Activision Publishing, which are the three named entities. And then it gets a little bit unclear exactly how much they want to go into the octopus of subsidiaries there. But at least named in the lawsuit are Activision-Blizzard, the parent, which includes everything that it owns, Blizzard and Activision Publishing. And they sued primarily on two grounds. It's about a 30-page lawsuit document. The first ground, which is what they open with, is essentially unequal treatment, discrimination. And that's on the basis of employment-related decisions for women working at Activision Blizzard. That's compensation, promotion, termination, original hiring. And what you may not hear in the articles that people are reading about this is that that's the bulk of the document. It's the most counts that they make as part of their complaint document. It's the most paragraphs and words that they use talking about Activision Blizzard itself. And that is the claim that Activision Blizzard is intentionally, willfully, maliciously, and oppressively discriminating against women. It's deliberately doing this. It's keeping their pay down. It's not hiring them when they should. It's not promoting them when they should. It's terminating them when male counterparts in a like situation are not terminated. And then from there, you get the second half of their complaint, which is essentially also, it should come as no surprise to you based on all that discrimination stuff we just said, that Activision Blizzard is a font of harassment. You might have seen the headline item, frat boy culture, I believe is what they use.
Yeah, I wrote that down in my notes, actually.
Yeah, and so that's the segue. So the way a lawsuit is written, in case you want to read it yourself, 30 pages honestly isn't that much for a state document, so you can check it out. And it's written to be read by the public, and we can talk about the strategies there that the state of California is using. But it's essentially discrimination and harassment, which are different, and then a couple more counts that are based around accusing Activision Blizzard of not preventing those things. And they include in that retaliation, which is a separate legal concept that is essentially you aren't promoting or you aren't paying people or you're terminating people for going to HR or for sending in a complaint to us. And that's what they also accuse Activision Blizzard of. Now, by the time you get to those counts at the end of that document, you're dealing in what's closer to boilerplate. that, okay, here's what an unequal pay claim looks like. Here's what a failure to hire and terminate early looks like. Here's what sexual harassment looks like. Here's what retaliation looks like. It's pretty boilerplate by the time you get there. So what everybody is talking about, what the reason this is going around to everyone is that there's 5 pages in the middle or so that is called Factual Allegations, where the state of California lays out what has been a part of their investigation, which, if you don't know, procedurally, they also admit and acknowledge that they've been investigating Activision-Blizzard for about 2 years, since the middle of 2018, which I recognize is closer to 3 years. They say it's 2 years. It's a long time. And so they've been investigating. About a month ago, at the end of June, according to their document, they finally finished their investigation, told Activision-Blizzard that they have problems, and then had mandatory mediation. In the state of California, there's a statute, and I go over this in the video that I did last week, that says when the Department of Fair Employment and Housing finally determines that there's been a violation of the law, according to it, then it has to go into mediation with the party that is violating the law, according to the department, and those parties have to try to settle things. That the state of California has an interest in avoiding litigation if it can, because litigation is costly, expensive, and if you can get the same penalty and everybody happy without it, they'd prefer to mediate. That's part of the fight here, because Activision made a couple of statements afterwards that we can talk about as part of this. But that's the overall lawsuit. The factual allegations then go and make data points, anecdotes, and say, all right, in investigating this, we've got people telling us that they were passed over for a promotion when they did more and better work than their male counterpart, that we were kicked out of pregnancy-related situations, or that they were harmed in their employment for things along those lines. That's the discrimination side. The harassment side is where you get those phrases that you've heard. Cube crawls, which is the primary paragraph in their allegations that effectively says that Activision-Blizzard had some kind of party that hopefully was regularly for purposes of the state of California bringing this claim, not hopefully as regularly for what they allege has happened at them, that was drinking at the office and had people go to various cubicles and cause trouble for women at Activision-Blizzard. They then have one claim that I found a little bit problematic, in that they named an individual that formerly worked at Blizzard as being a very big problem for the company, who I don't believe works there anymore. They have that paragraph, and they accuse that person of causing trouble. They also accuse J. Allen Brack, the president of Blizzard, of not doing enough about it. And then the third paragraph in that sexual harassment section is about what sounds to be a tragic suicide that happened to an Activision Blizzard employee, either in or around a hotel room while on a trip where her supervisor had brought sex toys of some kind. And whether or not that ties into the suicide is under great debate. Activision really only responded to one specific part in their statement about this, saying that the state of California was being completely ridiculous to tie the suicide to whatever they're claiming happened at the company. Those are the entirety of the factual allegations related to the sexual harassment claim. So what you've got is 5 or so pages of these data points, and then counts that say, essentially, Activision Blizzard has systematically failed the women working at its company, both on a discrimination basis and on a sexual harassment basis. And in my opinion, looking at the headlines, looking at the articles and the reporting on this for the past few days, the fact that it's primarily a discrimination complaint seems to get washed away a lot by the headline items with respect to the harassment. And that's fine. Every single bit of the complaint is deserving of the seriousness with which people are treating it. But it's a discrimination complaint and a harassment complaint. And the harassment is actually one count out of the, I think it's 12.
So I wanted to back up, because I've been taking copious notes.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm back in college lately, writing a bunch of notes as I listen to people smarter than me talk. What's the history with California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing being involved? Do you know, are they, I guess what I'm asking is, are they an activist kind of arm of the Attorney General in California, where they get involved in things to bring notice? Like you said, the complaint is written such that it's not necessarily a legal document that you need a legal education to fully understand.
It's well
I'm curious. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want to separate it in kind of two different thoughts. So the introduction of the lawsuit, very much written to be read by journalists, by you, by me, by whomever. The opening paragraph really has nothing to do with Activision Blizzard itself. It has footnotes to Gamergate articles. It has footnotes to Anita Sarkeesian feminist critiques of gaming. It has that kind of approach to start the document. By the time you get to the pleadings and the factual allegations, it's totally fine. I'm not a California lawyer. I think we should tell your listeners to start out with. But in terms of how these things should look, and certainly reviewing the elements that they are presenting against, it looks well pled. It looks like it would survive a cursory look at the document and saying, this isn't a violation of law. It would be if everything they said is true.
And I was going to say, the only other piece of shielding I was curious about with this before I go all in on them is because I'm trying to figure out ways that you can poke holes in this before I just automatically make assumptions about things, which I'm going to, I think, anyway. Because I guess I'm just curious, like, is California, I lived there for a long time, but I don't know anything about this.
I would describe California in general as aggressive. And I think, people's own philosophical stance, their own personality, their own political stance is going to determine whether or not you think that aggression is activist or not. They certainly take a stronger hand towards these kinds of things with respect to their employers and their companies operating in that state than other attorneys general. Frankly, the department itself and the powers that it's given to investigate and to litigate are more than maybe any state in the union. It's certainly most states in the union. And so it's kind of a known commodity that California will go in there and do this. You can go and look up stories from the past 12 months, say, and you see ABC Network has a lawsuit against it for harassment on the set of one of its shows. I think Disney might be dealing with one. They go in and do that. And certainly, depending on what side of how you think they're behaving you fall on, you could say, oh, well, they're just going and getting revenues for the state, or they're performing an important policing function that the other states should start to adopt as well. So it's, I look at that beginning, and you'll see me commented on in my video last week, but it's like, I don't love all that stuff. I don't love the stuff in a legal document that's clearly designed to be an advocacy editorial piece to start out with. I don't begrudge them that exactly. I just don't think it adds a lot to the document. And certainly a lot of what they presented seems, far as it stands in the complaint, from establishing willfulness and intentionality. That there is a grand gray area spectrum between we did our best and we failed, we put our heads in the sand, or we encouraged people to discriminate and harass. And California really filed that complaint based on going for it all. That this company was operating and functioning as deliberately trying to hold women down, bringing them in to hold women down and to harass them. That's a tough sell in any capacity.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking about it through the point of view of this kind of dichotomy with California and I guess any state going after its own corporations, where it's like, well, you want to make a fair and even playing field and do the right thing, and you also want to make it so that it's not onerous to do business in our state. And so Occam's razor simply tells me that they have the goods, because why would you go after a company that probably brings in tons of revenue, supports thousands of jobs, therefore tens of thousands of jobs apart from that, and so on and so on and so on. So just reading it from that perspective, I'm like, when the government gets involved, I'm against an onerous and overbearing government. I think most of us are. But when you study for 2 years and then you go and you file this, I feel like, well, that says something.
I have no doubt, and I think this gets lost in the wash a little bit when you hear a lawyer talk about the specific problems with vagueness and things, and I've talked to my commenters about this. But I have absolutely no doubt that the department is sitting on investigation, answers, responses, testimonies, whatever, that lead to all of the things that it alleged. There are, however, ways to interpret what they've been told that could be more generous to Activision, that could be different from what California did. And even as alleged, there's still the concern of, I'm not sure that they have shown with what is on that paper right now that there's systemic problems, as much as there are certainly, if you give them full benefit of the doubt, everything that they have is properly documented in their investigation, that those things happened, that they aren't bad seeds, that they weren't dealt with immediately, that the people weren't fired or otherwise handled. You don't get the kind of defense part, which you don't get in a complaint. That's not California's fault. California doesn't have to fight Activision's fight for it. But when we're reporting on these things, when we're talking about these things, again, as a lawyer, I look at the complaint and say, okay, that's a good starting place. That's interesting. And then let's go from there.
All right. So you had split it up, and I wrote in my notes, we have the discrimination, we have the harassment, and then we have Activision's, or the purported inactivity of Activision to do anything at all about any of this stuff. Let's start with the discrimination. In some ways, this seems you don't want to say what's most and least serious. I mean, an accusation, for instance, of suicide is very serious, an accusation of any of that kind of, but this seems to be the most serious just because it kind of hits women exactly where it hurts, just like it hits any person, which is in their wallet, their corporate ability to climb, do better for themselves, and being held down. So this seems to be in some way the most, for me, core nugget of it, because if you can prove this, then it wouldn't really be that big of a leap to assume that people were just not treating women, or some people were not treating some women very well at Activision. So what does it say about discrimination particularly, and how do you feel about its claims?
So the primary claim that they start out with, you can usually judge a litigation, a lawsuit, a complaint by the order that they do things in, just like you're writing a 5-paragraph essay in your high school class, whatever it might be. You start out with what you want to hit first. And the very first thing that they hit is that Activision is deliberately has unequal pay between their women and their men. And then by the time you get to factual allegations, they're starting to talk about people that don't get promoted and things like that. I will tell you from afar, and we don't know what we don't know in terms of the paperwork, the data, and everything else, that the way that this particular claim is presented is problematically vague from my perspective. And there are a couple of things that happen there, a couple that I mentioned in my video from last week. But one is they open their introductory paragraph. This is the sledgehammer that they've got. These are the strongest arguments. They say Activision itself has admitted to paying women less than men. Look at their proxy statement. And they put in a footnote a description of the various members of the C-level suite, the chief executive officer, operating officer, financial officer, people officer, legal officer, that kind of thing. And they say, look, they've already established that they're not paying women the same as men. And the big problem with that, and it's a pure footfall, this is as close as you can come to a straight up error at the beginning of a document like this, is that there is no question that a chief executive officer, who's a man at Activision, Bobby Kotick, does the same job as a chief people officer, who's in charge of human resources, controlling talent acquisition, all the stuff that actually goes into the compliance on this stuff. And the chief people officer is a woman. And they put this in there, and you look at it and you say, well, even in California, any state, the equal pay question is substantially similar work. Same person. You're paying a man and a woman the same. You're not distinguishing based on their sex or their gender or a number of other classifications. And you can absolutely distinguish on this person does the job better. This person does the job harder. This person came here longer and has been here for 2 years longer. All these various other criteria. And when you start your document and say, look here, Your Honor, or jury, here's where you can see Activision admits to a problem, and you compare a chief executive officer and a chief operating officer to a chief people officer, completely different departments, completely different functions. Everybody deserves the money that they're getting. Absolutely. Maybe Bobby, he's got $100 some odd million. We'll talk about that later. But the person in question here is not getting discriminated against based on that evidence. And so when you go further in the document and they say something along the lines of, this female that testified to us, that gave us this information, got passed over for this job, and she doesn't get paid as much as her male counterpart. You go, okay, well, you've already established that you take a very broad reading of counterpart. So what does this mean right here? We'd have to go deeper into when you say counterpart, how close are you slicing this onion? Because if you aren't slicing it close enough, then we can start to look at merit performance reviews, what the revenues are, what's happening. And they do present a couple of anecdotes or data points that are stronger. They have one that says this woman was working on more marketing campaigns that brought in more money than this guy over here.
Right.
But you're talking about individual instances. And if Activision-Blizzard isn't crazy, then every single compensation decision, every termination decision, every promotion decision has paperwork that's probably, a quarter inch thick that establishes here's what we evaluated and here's why we did this. And so to me, that's the one that's the most easily and most likely to be defended by Activision-Blizzard, unless they actually are deliberately discriminating on that basis, because they're going to have paperwork that shows how all these decisions were made. And a lot of what the state of California says on these things can be read the way they're reading it, absolutely, but is easily to imagine that it can be read the other way, that it's more generous to Activision. So I look at that and say it's absolutely the most important in terms of size, because remember, they're trying to present that they are representing every aggrieved woman. If you can show that Activision-Blizzard was deliberately keeping women's salaries down, that's probably applying to every woman. And then you got damages, and then you got punitive damages, and then California's collecting fines and all that stuff. That's where the money lives. But harassment is probably a little bit more targeted. If you didn't go to the cube crawl, you probably weren't affected by it, that kind of thing. So it's undoubtedly the biggest item and the one most likely to apply across the company. I think it's also the one that they're further from proving based on the factual allegations they made. The harassment stuff's a little harder to fight against depending on things like when it occurred and some of the ties that they're making in logic to things like that suicide.
This seems to be, because I'm glad you brought up kind of the punitive nature and kind of the overarching nature of this claim. If it was systemic at Activision, it seems like a bold claim. Have we seen, I don't know if you're paying attention to this, I assume you are in your own work and content, are women that have worked or are still working at Activision, have they kind of come out more forwardly to speak about this as far as you know, since this was filed? Because I've seen a lot of people posting apologies and videos and all of this. That really, I thought, pretty damning 2010 BlizzCon video.
So let's talk about that for a second, and then we'll talk about the employees. So that's an interesting one, because absolutely, I think damning is a good word from a psychological point of view, right? You look at that and you say, well, they do seem like assholes, right? Pardon my French, but you know, there's a reason that let's pretend this was a criminal case. You wouldn't be able to introduce that into evidence because it doesn't prove anything about your point, and it just makes the defendant look bad. And I think that's what happens in public and on Twitter and everything else. 100% it makes them look bad. And it's completely deserving of the commentary that it's getting on that score. Does that mean that they're systematically discriminating or harassing women in their employ at the company? No, right. It doesn't at all. It means that you want to say that they're bad actors, they behaved badly that day, and you want to say that's suggestive of them being bad actors in this different way to this different group. That's what we deliberately try to avoid in legal processes, because it's very easy to kind of taint. We're human beings. It's emotional. And you look at that and you say, yeah, I want to screw that guy, right? And yet you look at this and that doesn't actually inform as to what the state of California is asserting today.
Sure. I was just going to say, is it true that, I guess in this sort of claim, if this was to go to court, would they just have to prove it's more likely than not, as opposed to beyond, right? Isn't that the
it's a civil action. You're not talking about beyond a reasonable doubt. I'd have to look at what the California burden is on these, but it's almost certainly preponderance or something along those lines. And that's important too, because a lot of people have said, hey, why wouldn't anybody go to jail for some of these things? The answer is, if some of those are straight up true as described by California, then there probably should be like criminal investigations of some of that stuff. The answer is this is the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. It's not within their power to put people in cages, right? So they're using the power that is at their disposal. And who knows what the attorneys general are looking at the same time and that kind of thing. You asked about other employees. I just did a video just before we got on here that was talking about Activision's trouble with messaging and how they were kind of bouncing between different messaging poles. And that resulted in a strong contingent of vocal folks on social media that appear to be currently working at Activision-Blizzard, and a number of people that have said, yeah, something like this happened to me, and things along those lines. The difficulty there is, every person that says that kind of thing deserves the belief and worthiness of an investigation, of going through and determining the veracity of those complaints. Nobody should be ignored on that score. However, you get to something in social media that says this happened to me 15 years ago and it was fine with me then and I thought about it and it's not fine with me now, which is one of the kind of stories that's out there. And it's difficult for somebody like me who's looking at, okay, I can't know what I can't know from 2006 and how anybody was behaving and how you felt about it and whether or not that dovetails with what the state of California is asserting today, which puts us in this rough situation. And again, human beings don't need to be lawyers on this. I'm not going to sit here and tell you need to use preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt to talk about things on social media or on the internet. I just would say that there are possibilities, even for Activision-Blizzard, who you might hate due to their video game policies or their monetization principles or any other number of reasons. They only make Call of Duty and they killed the Spyro team or whatever else you hate about them. That there are areas where it's difficult to say that this is a systemic problem, because if you talk about something from 15 years ago and you got 10,000 employees, what level of problem becomes systemic? Every single thing that happens to somebody is bad, and it should be stamped out to the best of a company's ability, the best of our ability. But there's a difference between we had the right systems in place. We can't prevent a bad apple from suddenly deciding to do something. We did take action afterwards. And, oh, yeah, no, go to it, gentlemen. And I think that gets lost in the wash a little bit due to the legitimate emotionality of the issues and people that have dealt with real issues in their lives.
The other piece of this that you had described before we get into the kind of the, I guess, the preventative measures and kind of the culture there generally is this idea of harassment, sexual harassment, cube crawls, alcohol fueled kind of things.
Yep.
This I found personally interesting because having worked at IGN first as a freelancer and then as an intern and then for many years full time, it was a complete. It's what you. It seems like it was kind of the culture that's being described, minus what anything kind of untoward that I saw. Because I can honestly
crossing
say,
the line. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I can honestly say I've heard a lot of things that have happened at IGN since I was there, and about people that I worked with. I don't know what's true and what's not, but I can say that I never once witnessed personally something that I would have said has crossed that. Right. Someone did something to someone that crossed the line. I don't know how those people involved would feel about it, but I will say that it seems like I can kind of relate to the culture that's being described in some way when it's described as a frat boy culture, in the sense that people were drinking at work all the time. I mean, companies were in on this. They would bring us kegs, there were certain people with liquor all over their desks as like part of their display. And this goes, of course, beyond just that atmosphere. I talk all the time how I had like a huge Ron Paul sign at my desk. Like, could you imagine? And no one gave a shit about any of this stuff. And that was kind of what you sold people on when you wanted their talent to come work there. It's like, yeah, we roll in at like 10 sometimes, and we take 2-hour lunches, and it's kind of a familial sort of situation, and we drink and we party and we're friends, and so this seems like kind of adjacent to that, where you can kind of see that culture bleeding into something that's much more detrimental, especially at a company that's so large like Activision, where it would be easy to obfuscate that. It would be pretty hard at IGN to obfuscate that kind of behavior ultimately, because there's so few of us. So what's going on with this particular claim, and what do you think about kind of what it means about maybe the way game developers, game media, etc., kind of structure themselves anyway? It's kind of a party atmosphere, or it was.
Yeah, so I'm a corporate lawyer, so you're going to get the corporate lawyer first answer, which is this is why you don't have those cultures. This is why you don't allow those kinds of things. That the better safe than sorry. Lawyers are known for being risk averse, and what you described is not that unusual for a number of different companies, especially, I work a lot with startups. And as you get smaller to bigger, you're going to have that kind of smaller, we're all in this together, friends, party atmosphere, until you're not. You're going to get to a certain size and probably things change. Maybe they don't. And Activision's been around since the 70s, the freewheeling 70s. So, that's the corporate lawyer answer. This is why you don't roll in kegs. This is why you have very specific parties if you do. The more human beings living in the world answer is you're going to have certain things that happen. I think your description of what was occurring at your prior employer makes a lot of sense, which is, yeah, okay, we had parties, maybe we drank at the office, and I didn't see anything that crossed the line. And I think that's probably the bulk of the case. You have a cube crawl, and it's however many people are at headquarters, and maybe there's 7 or 8 bad instances at that particular day. And the bulk of people don't notice, right? They're having fun. They're having a party. And That presents a problem from the legal perspective. That potentially presents a problem from, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing's perspective. And that's why the lawyer, if you go and ask him, should we have a cube crawl? Say, what the hell are you talking about? What? No. and they go from there. However, you're balancing those things. And there is a reasonable belief that men and women can get along in that circumstance if people don't cross the line and they know where the line is. It's not a risk that I think is worth taking in most circumstances because, as you say, you're not going to be able to know what you don't know. But I think that there is, for companies that want to attract talent, that want to have some kind of atmosphere that they could support, there is that push and pull towards that. And I don't think you need to be nefarious. Blizzard and Activision don't need to be twirling their mustaches or talking like Darth Vader to say that this is why we had a cube crawl. There can be more generous readings of, we wanted morale to be high. We wanted people to feel like this was a place where they could have fun since they're spending so many hours here. And the unfortunate ramifications of that is some people out of 10,000 You tell them to go have fun, they're not going to have fun in the way that your legal counsel wants. And that's why you see, in my opinion, more sterile professional environments than even maybe 10 years ago. Is you get more and more of those chief legal officers saying, hey, if you get this lawsuit from California, regardless of how this turns out, Activision-Blizzard's having a hell of a week. They're going to have a hell of a month because they can't control the messaging on this. And this is just a complaint document. If they go into discovery, this whole thing is bad for them, and maybe could have been prevented by just saying no cube crawls. And so, was that worth the morale? Was that worth everything else? I would say not. And that's without even kind of talking about the truth or falsity of the claims against them, because it's so clear that you can imagine people going over the line. It's not difficult to say, that kind of thing could happen. Absolutely. And you get testimony in California, and here you are.
I was just going to say, it's you can imagine that, and I'm thinking back to my own time in the industry. It's so interesting. It's not unusual for companies where people date each other and stuff, but there's that whole added component of chemistry at IGN. I dated a sales girl for a little while in like 2008, 2009 or something like that, and so then all of these different interpersonal relationships are developed, and like it becomes this very complex soup, which is why it's so fascinating to hear you say, because I agree with you. It's like, wow, what the fuck were they thinking? Like, it's none of us, I guess, did anything or during that era. Nothing came of it, at least that we know of. But
right,
it's like, man, what were you thinking? Because that did seem normal. I roll out of college at a Northeastern, and at 22 years old, go straight to IGN, San Francisco, and it's like an identical culture.
Yeah,
and it's like I didn't have to really adjust. I was like, oh, this is kind of like everyone's in their 20s, and we're all poor, and we all love games, and it's all weird, So
and you see those cultural shifts, right? I mean, you can go just look at a television show. You can go look at like something like Mad Men, and you could see, we're not the 50s or the 60s, and things progressing. And I think in general, a good direction. There's discussions of sterility, and one of the things that comes up in this complaint is that Blizzard and Activision should be responsible for the fact that nobody likes HR. That one of the things that the state of California found is that people didn't want to go to HR, and that HR was not seen as an advocate for them. And one of the things I said in my video is, it's the rare HR department that people like. HR is adjacent to the mission of the company. They aren't writing the articles. They aren't making the widgets. They aren't making the video games. They're moving talent around. And if you get a good one, then that's okay. But they're making you go to meetings you don't want to go to. They're making you sign documents that are boring and that take you out of whatever it is that you're doing. And so even the best HR department is going to not be your favorite place. And HR ultimately is an arm of the company. And people are smart enough to know that now, right? That HR is protecting the company and its interests. And so there's always going to be that tug and pull as to what it's supposed to do. And when you complain to HR, what's going to happen? Because they're going to tell the bosses and, whatever. And so I looked at that and said, well, I don't view that as terribly dispositive for the California complaint. People didn't like HR. Yeah, if that's all you need, you're in trouble. So it's this whole kind of melange of, it appears that bad things happen to people, which is tragic, and you don't want to see it, and you want to see actions taken. And did Activision-Blizzard take those actions? I don't know. When are the complaints from? California didn't put any timing on any of these things. So one of the things Activision says on its statement is, these are from a decade ago, and we've taken steps, and they're out of context, and things like that. If the last cube crawl was 10 years ago, does that change the story of what's happening at that company? I mean, I would argue that it does, at least in some respects, that Activision-Blizzard could have themselves said, no, let's not do that. And that's different.
I was going to say, that's a good point, too, because that happened even at my time at IGN. Like, it became different even in my time there without anything ever coming to fruition.
People looked at it and said, this is silly, and this is risky, and we shouldn't do it. Yeah, and that's normal, and that's what you want. If you're the state or anybody else that wants to see these things continue to progress in a good ways, you want these companies to say, okay, yeah, this is silly. People can go and have their bar nights themselves. Let's not facilitate it at the company level, and let's not have accidentally people cross the line and cause real trouble for the enterprise.
In my mind, running a company, I mean, I want everyone to be happy with us too, but I always felt like I feel like people are too. It's kind of an aside, but they're too focused on like the geography of where everyone is. Like, everyone's together, everyone's at this place all the time, and my whole thing is like, I would rather people work as little as possible so that they have their own lives and are excited and enthusiastic when they need to work, as opposed to forcing social interaction or forcing camaraderie where none necessarily exists. So I experienced that too there. But the third thing that you brought up that I wanted to talk about is kind of the preventative measures or lack thereof, and kind
Sure.
of Activision's inability to govern itself. It's funny you brought up HR, because in my corporate experience, HR, you always feel like HR should really be like the ombudsman, but they're not. Like you said,
No.
they don't call balls and strikes. They're calling balls and strikes with the company stuff shoving money into their back pockets. So it's like you said, no mystery that they're not liked, and they weren't liked at IGN either. I'm also
and it's not their
curious
fault.
about.
I had some HR people come into my comments and be like, well, we do our best. It's like, I totally get that. This is a function of a structure. This is what HR is.
Right.
So I get that. There are good ones, and they try their best, and it's still going to be annoying in a certain important respect, right? Because, one of the things that Activision-Blizzard says is, hey, we have all these policies and procedures, and everybody goes to anti-harassment and anti-discrimination training. That's all true. And if you're not a harasser or a discriminator, the annual version of those meetings is annoying. It's 3 hours of your afternoon that it's like, okay, I'm not that person. Thank you, though. And that's your interaction with HR maybe for that quarter. So
Right.
it becomes, it becomes, okay, all right, we get it. You send me our benefits changes for the year, and then you make me go to meetings. I understand. And so I do want to, if there's anybody listening that's from HR, I get it. Do your best. I understand. It's a structural thing as much as anything else.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No hate from me either. I just understand the structural nature of it. My company's not big enough to, God only knows what we would even do with it.
You could hire an HR person. Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to ask you though about these preventative measures is kind of the nature of Activision as a corporate entity, because I don't think people realize, I'm sure but I don't think a lot of people realize, they look at Bobby Kotick as this kind of nefarious figure, and he may or may not be this malign figure. I don't know, but he's been the CEO of Activision for 40 years.
Yeah.
And I don't think people understand that he saved Activision and is the reason it exists, and then has been the CEO since like the mid NES generation with no interruption. And this creates a very, what I would imagine is strong center of gravity at the highest levels of your corporate structure, especially because he controls a lot of the company in shares as well. So he has some sort of voice with the board, obviously, or he would probably not be CEO for very long. So what do you think about, is that, am I reading that wrong, that could have a lot to do with like CEOs come and go in a lot of companies, and then they become CEO of another company, or they go somewhere else. Having a man, confirmed as CEO for 40 years in a publicly traded company is pretty wild, and I imagine has something to do with the culture there.
Yeah, I don't think that that's wrong at all. I mean, I think I was in another conversation earlier this week that was talking about why this seems to happen in video games so often. And I'm not sure it's unique to video games as much as some people think it is. But I will say that video games, Activision, as you rightly point out, are very often founder-led. We're still in an industry that's young enough that the people that started the company, even if it's big and fancy and multinational and global now, are maybe still in control of it, maybe still leading it. And in the startup world, in smaller business world, you have things that are called founder-led companies, and they're kind of a specific, unusual animal because they very much take on the qualities and characteristics of the founder or founders group. And gaming, even if you're publicly traded, even if you're making billions of dollars, if it's still your founder group, if it's still your core kernel, then there's something about the culture of your entity that's likely to be incorporated by that individual. So is Bobby Kotick a discriminator or harasser? I have no idea. I couldn't tell you Bobby Kotick from Adam. But I will say that as a company, it's a little less corporate. It's a little less controlled by modern structures and policies and procedures than you might expect for a similarly situated multinational publicly traded company. And that's going to happen when you have the same person. And that's the same for the smaller companies. You think about things like Insomniac being purchased by Sony. Insomniac was a function of Ted Price and the founders for a very long time, and were doing things like staying independent because that's what they wanted and focusing on things that they wanted, in a way that makes sense for a lot of video game companies. We know their names because of that kind of cultural massive gravity. We know Gabe Newell runs Valve because he runs Valve and always has. And gaming is unusual in that respect. So it's a possibility that culturally, individuals at Activision that have been steering that ship for a long time legitimately are bad apples. I couldn't tell you. And I don't know that the state of California tells you in the document that they provide.
What do you think? So we're talking about the C-suite and at the very highest levels of the company. I guess what were the preventative measures trickling down from them that could have been made that are basically being claimed were going unnoticed? You brought up one thing that I read, which I thought was interesting, which was the very demonstrable discrimination, it seemed, in one situation with a marketer in which she was clearly passed over in some sort of boys club situation. It seems like, even though she was much more apt and able. What's going on here in terms of what should have been done and what California is kind of claiming? Because you had even mentioned, and I guess it's in the statement as well, that there was California induced mandatory mediation.
Yeah.
So what's going on with this whole thing? Like, they tried to get involved, and what did they find on this front?
Your guess is as good as mine, because they don't actually talk about the policies, procedures, and things that Activision is doing as much as they say that they're inadequate. So the standard is that they weren't taking all reasonable steps to try to eliminate harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. And that's ultimately what gets put in that document. Ordinarily, if we just separate from the Activision and Blizzard question, you're talking about, do I have a good employee handbook? Do I have a good department ability to respond to complaints, especially of the nature of discrimination or harassment? Do the employees know who it is that they should talk to? Are we, when we get a complaint like that, are we looking into it? Are we investigating it properly? Or are we immediately dismissing it? When we get something that's really significant, like the ones that Blizzard is claimed to have happened with the individual that the actual state of California names, are we sweeping that under the rug? Are we just slapping his wrist? Are we firing him? Are we doing something that's appropriate for the level of problem that seems to have been established by our investigation? Their claim, the state of California, is that essentially, because Activision, we know, has policies and procedures that are pretty normal for corporate America, you know, they in their response letters, they have references to their DEI group, they have references to their anti-discrimination and anti-harassment meetings and their policies and procedures. We know that they have some kind of package that is normal for this kind of thing, that essentially Blizzard and Activision is ignoring it. And more specifically, they're ignoring it in such a systematic way that people know that HR is never going to do anything for them. Presumably on the premise that if you're imagining yourself as a woman at Activision Blizzard, that you know some friend had a legitimate problem, they went to HR and it was completely ignored and swept under the rug. And now that kind of notion happens enough times that the women of Activision Blizzard know that no matter what's in that handbook or anything else, nothing's going to be done for them. And if you get to that level, which is essentially what the state of California says has happened, then you can tell Activision Blizzard that your policies and procedures, what's on the page, whatever you're doing, is not sufficient to keep down harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. And that's kind of distinct from the actual claims that Blizzard Activision is doing it itself, but not taking those policies and procedures on, not doing enough to stop these things. That's the kind of thing that you can evidence with just enough data points. Hey, if this happens every month, then clearly whatever it is you're doing isn't satisfactory. But again, we're talking about 3 paragraphs. It depends on what that timeline is. It's 10,000 people. It depends on how many people are affected. It's just not in the complaint.
What is Activision's defense, do you think, here? I made the claim, or if they have one, I don't know. I assume they do if they went to mediation. I was talking about the Ubisoft situation recently on a recent episode. It's funny, another company that's just been helmed by the same person forever, this time Yves Guillemot. So another cult of personality sort of corporation that is widely accused of having a boys club culture as well. A little more believable, not to be stereotype, but, you know, France a little bit more loose perhaps with some of their cultural mores, you know, in a lot of different ways, which is up to them to govern, but still that is bled over into all of their studios, and that is a big piece of it. But I was making the argument that maybe, and this is the Occam's razor kind of argument for me, the kind of most obvious thing is like, maybe Ubisoft has a defense of this, which is why when everything started cropping up again and people are like, well, this guy's still in this position and this guy's still in this position, I'm like, well, is Ubisoft stupid, or doesn't that state that they researched and they were like, well, this didn't actually happen the way it was said, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So with this Activision situation, I'm wondering, what do you assume their defense is, and what are the next steps here about the way that they might interchange with California to get this solved?
Well, they've signaled a number of their defenses. The very first one that they signaled was that they don't feel that the mediation process was properly fulfilled. So I mentioned that the state of California has to go through a mandatory mediation process to try to settle things out of court. And one of the things that Activision says is California never told us what we did wrong, never told us what they were looking at. And the mediation, even though they mentioned, I think it's 4 meetings maybe at the top of July, even if we had those meetings, they weren't ever the good faith conversations that the statute was supposed to have. So I strongly suspect Activision is going to relay that in their counter document and is going to potentially ask the court to send them back to mediation. And to say, yeah, court order at real mediation, and we'll go through that so that we can avoid litigation. The other defense, I think the one that's the most obvious, is that they are going to fight tooth and nail against that suicide paragraph. That's the next line in their initial response to IGN and to others on, I believe it was Thursday or Friday. And you see that when they start decrying California and saying California is keeping companies down and the unelected bureaucrats and all the other stuff that is unusual for a corporate statement, that one of the things they say is it's absolutely outrageous that they brought that paragraph. And one does wonder, if you look at, even if we give full faith and credence to whatever California's collected, you do wonder exactly how they get to evidence that allows them to have the sentence that this suicide happened because of this harassment, when they don't actually allege harassment. They only allege a relationship with a supervisor. And that's not ideal. Certainly the lawyer, again, would say, come on, guys. But that one seems tough. It's like, what is that evidence? What do you have that suggests that you can tie those? And Activision responds so strongly to that suggests to me that there's other things going on that led to a suicide. None of this is ideal to talk about, obviously, for Activision or for California or for certainly the family and of that particular employee. I think the other thing that they will definitely use, I think that they will not be silly enough to not have documentation for all the equal pay stuff. They'll have showings of how people were evaluated on merit, valued on tenure, how the women and the men had different jobs, performing different functions. They'll be able to put data on that forever and a day. And I strongly suspect they'll be able to do that. If they can't, then yeah, they deserve to lose on that kind of thing. And then with respect to the other types of harassment, they will try to be showing that it's isolated incidents, that they responded to them appropriately. They'll be able to show that for if they can win that the suicide wasn't related to the harassment, and if they can show that the guy in the second paragraph that California names was terminated as quickly as was reasonable for an investigation, then you're left with cube crawls. And then it's, when did they happen? Who was affected? You didn't give us any details there. And so they'll be trying to establish that we're a corporate American citizen. We have these policies and procedures. We can do better to encourage people to go to HR, but people are people, and we're working with a group of people that maybe don't trust in those institutional processes because they don't trust corporations. Who can blame them? And going from there. So you're going to see this multifaceted defense. I don't think you're going to see Activision in their legal documents just come out with the California just wants companies to suffer and they're unelected and terrible and offensive and that kind of thing. That initial statement was unusual for a corporation, and kind of doubled down on a little bit in kind of writ small in the email that we saw from their compliance officer, their chief compliance officer, that was leaked out a couple of days ago. So they have defenses. All of these things are so fact and circumstances dependent that you're going to be, if you go to court, if you go to discovery, you're going to be getting into the weeds as to what is this specific instance. You mentioned the one that I said was their strongest case, which is that they said this woman had more marketing campaigns that made more money than their male counterpart, and the male counterpart was promoted. I said in my video, that seems obvious, that seems clear. However, you can imagine that, yes, she made more in aggregate revenue on more marketing campaigns, and the guy made more on average for one campaign, and they thought he was doing better. It's not impossible to create fact patterns that say, yes, you wrote it that way, and that's true technically, but this is what we based our opinion on. That's fully legal, and that's why he got the promotion or he got the raise. And you get into these fights on all of these separate data points. And one of the things California did here is to get those Twitter things out there to potentially get more people testifying to their investigation, to get into more discovery and make this a big money fight. But Activision has its defenses, but we don't know what the facts are. We know what California has said the facts are. There are ways to imagine that they aren't fully the whole truth. If they are the whole truth, then Activision is going to be in a lot of trouble.
In closing out, because we're kind of now waiting for the next step, waiting for more information and all
Yes.
the rest. I'm curious now, in capping this off, how do you think other companies in the space are looking at this? Not only with Activision-Blizzard, but of course, we mentioned earlier Ubisoft. There are claims emanating out of places like IGN a while ago. There were the stuff with Chris Avallone at Techland, etc. We don't know what's true and what's not. I mean, I even think about the thing like with Chris Hardwick a couple years ago that just disappeared.
Sure.
Like, I guess that was, I don't know, that was nothing, but, or maybe it was something, I don't know. But how do we feel like in this Me Too movement? And it kind of seems like it's waning in some way. People have it's kind of more part of the social fabric now. But how do you feel like the companies and their peers are looking at this? With a little bit of fear, I would imagine.
If you are running a video game company in California and you don't look at the first paragraph of that lawsuit and say, we have to assume that they're going to interpret everything that ever happened here in the worst possible light and fix it as much as possible, then you aren't doing your job as legal or compliance or whatever. And is that fair? Maybe not. But the state of California has signaled that not only are they going to do this, they're specifically not thrilled with the video game industry. Like, there's a sentence in there that has nothing to do with Activision-Blizzard, but just talks about sexism in video games. And it's like, okay, when you start there, well, we have to take note, and we have to understand that. Now, one of the things I said in my video when I read their statement was Activision is signaling in that statement that there's a non-zero chance they just leave. Now, that won't get them out of this lawsuit, but it would get them out of the next one. When I say non-zero, I mean 15%, something that's significant, certainly not a done deal, but that says, the tax rates are high here. We've proven that remote working can work at least somewhat. Why are we here? Especially if you're going to take everything that's happened, even if we assume that it did happen and it's true, and perceive it in the worst possible light. Again, for argument's sake, assuming that Activision Blizzard doesn't have a systemic problem. You can see why, if you don't have a systemic problem or you don't think you do, and you've gone through all these policies and procedures, and you have a chief compliance officer that you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to, and you have a chief people officer that gets $4 million, and you have all these people that the state still turns around on you and you say, well, look, we can't please you. And so what are we doing? And that's where that anger comes from. Now, I do think that statement was ill-advised. It clearly wasn't vetted by legal or by PR, and it comes across as very vitriolic. And when you're under pressure in public in a crisis scenario, I apologize, you have to try to get around that emotionality and to get out there with, we understand the state of California is doing its best to protect its people. We think their weaponry is mistargeted at this company. We intend to help explain that to them and to the jury and the court if it gets that far. We'll see you there. You're trying to establish, we understand these are important issues. We know they're important issues. We don't think they happened here the way that was described. You go out and you say California is just trying to kill companies and all this stuff it's not good. Everybody that doesn't already believe you is going to not believe you more.
Right.
Outside of that, I think most companies are doing their best. I think culturally, there's always a good reason to say, hey, everything that's described there, whether or not it happened, whether or not it's systemic, everything that's described there is bad. You start talking about groping, you start talking about rape jokes at work, and all that's bad. Shouldn't happen. And I think we can all agree on that. And so, that should continue to be pushed. But outside of that, if I'm in California, I'm worried. And I'm potentially looking around depending on how deep my roots are.
Yeah, I would imagine living in California and actually founding this company in California before moving it, that, yeah, man, I mean, just for the money situation, you should definitely leave. But yeah, I would imagine that's why I was asking at the top, and you really answered it very well, which was just like, what is the nature of this California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and how adversarial are they in terms of scaring away their tax base? And it's so, in other words, they really have to pick and choose their battles. And Activision's response to this, it just makes it seem like California does think there's something here, and Activision does believe that they can defend themselves. So it seems like you said, maybe we're coursing towards discovery, which I imagine is absolute like klaxons ringing at Activision
It's such a nightmare.
for just for exposing just anything. I mean, we saw with the Apple and Epic shit, right? Like how much just arbitrary things are exposed that have nothing to do with it. That was what was so interesting. I imagine that might be the situation here, which is
Sony charges for crossplay. How did that get out? Yeah, no. Right. So no, it's a nightmare for anybody to go through discovery for, especially an aggressive state actor that wants to go into your most sensitive materials. The compensation decisions, the hiring, the fire, that's some of the most sensitive stuff that you have at your company. And so it's not ideal. And in any normal world, I would tell you that Activision will settle. They'd find a way. And I still think they will. But with California clanging the bell of self-righteousness, they believe in their cause in their document. Activision, with that response, suggests that they believe that they're in the right. And one of the things you talk about in law school is that litigation is a bad idea for everybody. If you could just come to the number before going through that whole process, you just do the number and not pay the lawyers. And that's how settlements work. It's only when each side kind of has a misunderstanding of what their chances of success are, and somebody's ill-advised, they're both passionate, and they both think they're right, that's when you get an actual nuclear exchange. That's when you get the bet the company, fire everybody, discovery, and everything else. So there's a non-zero chance of that here, just based on the emotionality of the statements. I think cooler heads will prevail at Activision and say, what can we live with giving California? Because going through our emails and everything else is a problem.
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, we'll have you back, obviously, when we learn more about this. And obviously, there are parallel situations, like we said, with Chris Avallone and Ubisoft and even at Quantic Dream and another French studio and other places. So we'll keep an eye on all of this. I'm glad to have you on, though, Mr. Hoeg, because I think I said on the regular show, I'm just not kind of prepared to talk about this in any meaningful way. And I'm not really interested in, I mean, everyone, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's so trite, right? Like everyone who's not against sexual harassment, who doesn't want people to be treated fairly? And so at some point, you're just kind of pontificating for pontification's sake, as opposed to getting into the deeper nuance of the situation. And I'm not equipped to do that. So I'm glad to have you on, and I appreciate your time in doing
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would add, I think you asked me about other companies. The one thing that I didn't love, and this is just personal, and maybe other people love it, there was over the weekend a few threads and things of companies essentially going out there and preening, saying how awesome they are. And one of those that jumped out at me, I covered it today, was Bungie, that came out with a thread and said, we value everybody. We have a zero tolerance policy, which is exactly what Activision said, by the way, in their statements. And then said the exact right thing in terms of what's true, which is nobody's perfect. And the law doesn't require you to be perfect on this, because you can have somebody that works for you for 40 years, it's a saint, and has a bad day and does something bad. And what the law requires is, what do you do about it?
Right.
Not, you can prevent every human being from doing something bad. And so Bungie says, we know we're not perfect, but we do our best. And then you basically have statements from ex-Blizzard and Activision people come out and say similar things. And I don't love that. Activision-Blizzard's in its own thing. If they did something bad, the law should come down on them. If they have defenses, they should be entitled to them. You're Bungie, you're whoever, you're whatever other company. Everybody is in agreement that the stuff that happens as described is bad. Activision isn't trying to go out there and saying it's not bad. They're saying it's out of context, or that it's not being told correctly. And so you go out there and say, we're better. I don't love it. And unfortunately, you see that in social media. You see that in interactions a lot. And if I could do anything, I would get rid of that kind of stuff. Bungie, of course, is an Activision partner that collected tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of a contractual relationship with Activision. So that's what I look at and say, okay, just stay out of it. Not everybody needs to have an opinion on everything. Bungie, if you're doing great, I'm proud of you. Good stuff. That should be really the minimal that we expect from people.
It's so funny you brought that up. I didn't even think about that, just in the sense that Bungie's lawyers might be saying, like, listen, if they go into discovery, we had a deep relationship with these guys on Destiny, and we might be involved in this shit and wrapped up in it. So we should at least have something to say. I didn't even really think about that, which is why there's so many partners. Activision doesn't often go outside of their borders, but I'm sure there are certain partners like FromSoft, I think, and others that have worked with them where it's like, oh man, we better make sure our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted. But Mr. Hoeg, where can people find you online if they want to hear more of your legalisms?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I did a video going through the actual lawsuit document in Virtual Legality, which is the primary show that I have on our YouTube channel, which is Hoeg Law, which is Hoeg. A lot of people want to spell that in a number of different ways, many of which will still lead to me, some of which will not. Watch out for that. Or you could follow me on Twitter at Hoeg Law, same spelling, where you'll probably get some previews of various things that I'm going through. If you had been following me on Twitter right before I made that video, you would have seen that I knew about that lawsuit about when it happened because thankfully people like the show and my phone would not stop beeping for opinions on that when it got filed. So I put together a Twitter thread that talked about some of the issues that I saw just reading through it, which then made its way into an 1.5 hour long video the next day. So we are on YouTube, we're on Twitter. Basically, that's it right now. But who knows in the future? And of course, I'm on here.
Yeah,
you can see me on like we'll 6 videos now.
Yes, and I want to just reiterate your performance on the Returnal review discussion was legendary. I mean, people really loved that conversation. I don't know if that one's live for everyone yet, but it will be eventually. This is going to go live for everyone at the same time because I think
fantastic.
Yeah, I think this is just an important topic we probably shouldn't be paywalling. So, Mr. Hoeg, thank you for your time. Wishing you all the best in your neck of the woods, and thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of our show and all of our content on Last Stand Media. Support us on Patreon, etc. We'll see you next time. Goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.